The enduring legacy of Tolkien's works is seen in the ubiquitous use of his vision of what a fantasy world consists of in other fantasy works, from fantasy literature to Warcraft to Dungeons and Dragons. These worlds are populated by elves, dwarves, hobbits, orcs, and trolls as Tolkien envisioned them. Even in fantasy tropes, especially in the defeat of evil by good, later authors tend to follow the pattern established by Tolkien, with the main hero saving the world through a victorious quest. In addition to these homages to Tolkien's works, the Tolkien estate releases new books periodically, the latest being The Fall of Gondolin, which shows the progression of the story of Tuor, the son of Huor, and the fall of the city of Gondolin over the course of several drafts. It is no surprise, being such an influential work, that much work has been done looking at what mythological and literary allusions Tolkien makes. Two major sources are traditionally cited as important influences: Anglo-Saxon and Germanic literature, as well as his Catholic faith. A couple of examples showed the extent of his allusion to these works of Germanic literature. In The Hobbit, as the dwarves make it to the Lonely Mountain and open a secret door, they send Bilbo in alone, who burgles a cup from the hoard of the dragon Smaug. A similar scene is found in the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, introducing the final enemy Beowulf is to fight, the great dragon, which is awoken from its slumber when a cup is stolen from its hoard by a runaway slave. Other Germanic texts influential in Tolkien's works, for example in the Silmarillion, one of the great human heroes, although perhaps more of an anti-hero due to the curse which follows him and his family, Turin Turambar, slays the great dragon of Morgoth, Glaurung, by hiding in a trench and stabbing him in the belly with his sword Gurthang. Glaurung does not immediately die, however, and is able to have a brief conversation with Turin, to whom he reveals the full nature of the curse upon his family, his marriage to his own sister. This episode of the Silmarillion closely parallels the Germanic story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, one of the Volsungen, who kills the dragon Fafnir. In both stories, the heroes lie in depressions and wait for the dragon, slaying them by driving their swords into the dragon's underbelly. In both stories, too, the dragon and dragon slayer have a brief chat, after which the dragon dies. While perhaps not as easy to tease out as the allusions to Germanic literature, the Catholic faith of Tolkien is another major influence on his works. As Tolkien himself says, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." A great deal of ink has been spilled attempting to pinpoint exactly how Christian symbolism is present in Tolkien's works. A number of the articles in the collection, The Silmarillion, 30 Years On, discuss this aspect of Tolkien's work in detail. Equally great amounts of ink have been spilled in the quest to find other allusions. So, for example, the collection of papers in Tolkien the Medievalist, which examines a wide variety of medieval literature to which Tolkien may be alluding. Others have pointed out Tolkien's allusions to the Prose Edda, the Finnish Kalevala epic, Celtic mythology, and many others. In looking at the various influences on Tolkien's work, one rather contentious question is the idea of Tolkien's use of classical literature in his writing. Tolkien's purpose is to fill the void of the lost Anglo-Saxon mythology by creating a new mythology for England. For this, he considered the classical Greek and Roman mythologies not up to the task, due to the temperament of the English, influenced by the climate of the respective regions. By not adopting classical mythology, Tolkien creates an image of himself as, quote, determinedly hostile to the classical tradition, even that he, quote, turned his back enthusiastically on the classics that had nurtured his generation at school. If this is understood as Tolkien's attitude towards the classics, then looking for allusions to such would seem to be a fool's errand. Why would there be such allusion? In 2005, in his article on classical influence in Tolkien, however, J.K. Newman, no relation, points out that at the same time Tolkien was creating this new, possibly classics-free mythology, he writes a poem to Edith, which describes two lovers as trees standing together, as Apollonius Rhodius does in the meeting of Jason and Medea in Book 3. J.K. Newman is not the first to discuss Tolkien's use of classical literature, and he points out some other studies, such as Mac Fenwick's Breastplates of Silk, Homeric Women in the Lord of the Rings from 1996, and Stevens' From Catastrophe to Eucatastrophe, J.R.R. Tolkien's transformation of Ovid's mythic Pyramus and Thisbe into Beren and Luthien from 2004. Other scholarship, looking primarily at episodic examples of classical allusion in Tolkien, are Christine Fussmeyer and Ulrike Freubel's discussion of possible classical examples for the wizard Gandalf, James Obertino looks at how the trek through Moria parallels the underworld in Virgin, and Miriam Libran Moreno discusses how the story of Turin Turambar reflects Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus. That brings me to the first point of this paper, the catalogue of Gondor. One of the points Mac Fenwick makes in his study of Tolkien's use of Homeric women to show that Tolkien's use of classical allusion is not merely a subconscious one, influenced by his British schooling in the classics, is that in one of the early drafts of The Return of the King, the margin of the chapter Minas Tirith has the words, quote, Homeric dialogue written in it. In this chapter, the beleaguered city of Minas Tirith awaits aid from the outlying regions of Gondor, and Tolkien gives a description of the armies sent to defend the capital city. Quote, leading the line there came walking a big thick-limbed horse, and on it sat a man of wide shoulders and huge girth, but old and grey-bearded, yet mail-clad and black-helmed, and bearing a long heavy spear. Behind him marched proudly a dusty line of men, well armed and bearing great battle-axes. Grim-faced they were, and shorter and somewhat swarthier than any men that Pippin had yet seen in Gondor. And so the companies came, and were hailed and cheered, and passed through the gate. The men of Ringlu Vale behind the son of their lord, Dervarin striding on foot, 300s. From the uplands of Morthond, the great Blackroot Vale, tall Duinhir with his sons, Dwylin and Derufin, and 500 bowmen. From the Anfalas, the Langstrand far away, a long line of men of many sorts, hunters and herdsmen, and men of little villages, scantily equipped save for the house of Golaskil, their lord. From Lamedon, a few grim hillmen without a captain. Fisher folk of the Ether, some 100 or more spared from the ships. Hirluin the fair of the green hills of Pinathgelin, with 300s of gallant green-clad men. At last and proudest, Imrahil, prince of Dol Amroth, kinsman of the Lord, with gilded banners bearing his token of the ship and the silver swan, and a company of knights in full harness, riding grey horses, and behind them 700s of men-at-arms, tall as lords, grey-eyed, dark-haired, singing as they came. Such a disparate group of warriors come together to defend Minas Tirith, from great knights and lords on horses and in full armor, to fishermen and hunters, carrying crude weapons and marching on foot. Despite their differences, however, each of the companies is described according to the same paradigm. Each description includes the place of origin of the company, the name of the lord or lords leading it, the number of men, and a description of a unique aspect of each group, the grim faces and battle-axes of the men of the Falas, or the green outfits of the men of Pinathgelin. As Tolkien's note in the margin suggests, this description of the companies corresponds to the Homeric catalogue of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, and the following description of the Trojan forces. If Tolkien is consciously alluding to the Iliad in this scene, it begs the question, why? One possibility is that this type of paradigm in describing troops becomes a standard in epic. So, for example, the description of the troops loyal to Dionysus in Nonnus's Dionysiaca. Similar descriptions exist outside of Greek literature as well. In the Tain Bokolan, for example, the cattle raid of Cooley, in which the arrival of various squadrons of warriors that make up the main host of Queen Mab is described, it is possible, then, that Tolkien is plugging into this epic tradition for imagery, and that there's no more to it than that. However, when reading Tolkien's passage, companies of warriors coming from disparate areas for the defense of one city, the reader cannot help but connect it with the catalogue of Trojans at the end of Book 2 of the Iliad, which describes the various contingents which come to Troy to help defend the city from the Greek armies. The city of Minas Tirith becomes, then, a new Troy in the mind of the reader, and informs the expectation of the reader as to what will occur as the story continues. Boromir and Hector. One of the more prominent deaths in the Iliad is that of Hector, who is killed in Book 22 in what is perhaps an ill-conceived single combat against Achilles, who in turn is seeking revenge for the death of his friend Patroclus. In Book 24, Hector's father, Priam, decides to ransom his son's body from Achilles. As he prepares to go, he has some of his surviving sons prepare his wagon for him. Quote, he drove the men away with his staff, and they went forth as the old man sped them. Then he called to his sons, upbraiding Helenus, Paris, noble Agathon, Pammon, Antiphanes, Polites of the loud battle cry, Deiphobos, Hippothos, and Dius. These 9 did the old man call near him. Come to me at once, he cried, worthless sons who do me shame. Would that you had all been killed at the ships, rather than Hector. In his grief at the death of his son Hector, Priam, the king of Troy, does not mince words in dealing with his other sons, any of whom he would trade to have Hector and his other, quote, brave sons returned to him. Priam mourns not only for his sons, however, but for Troy itself, whose destruction and his own death he sees in the fall of Hector. Denethor, the steward of Gondor and the de facto ruler of the city of Minas Tirith, too mourns for the loss of his eldest son Boromir, who died defending the hobbits Merry and Pippin from the orcs at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. Denethor expresses a similar wish as Priam does when speaking with his second son, Faramir. Quote, "Would that have availed to change your judgment," said Denethor. "You would still have done just so, I deem. I know you well, ever your desire is to appear lordly and generous as a king of old, gracious, gentle. That may well befit one of high race if he sits in power and peace, but in desperate hours gentleness may be repaid with death." "So be it," said Faramir. "So be it," cried Denethor, "but not with your death only, Lord Faramir, with the death also of your father, and of all your people, whom it is your part to protect now that Boromir is gone." "Do you wish then," said Faramir, "that our places had been exchanged?" "Yes, I wish that indeed," said Denethor, "for Boromir was loyal to me and no wizard's pupil. He would have remembered his father's need, and would not have squandered what fortune gave. He would brought me a mighty gift." Once again, the father mourns the death of his son, and considers his younger child weaker and an unworthy successor. It seems possible then, in light of Priam and Denethor's similar reactions, to look back at Boromir's character in other situations. Like Hector, Boromir is the defender of the city, the champion who embodies the city's defense, without whom the very survival of the city is in doubt. In both cases, too, the death of the hero is due to a mistake each one makes, against the best counsel of others. When Hector leads the Trojan assault in Book 12 on the ramparts the Greeks build to defend their ships, Polydamas, one of the Trojan captains, counsels him against the assaults, due to an ill omen. Hector allows his own arrogance to get the best of him, and ignores his advice and assaults the walls. This leads to Patroclus donning Achilles' armor, and ultimately to the return of Achilles to the war. Even when Hector is standing at bay in front of the city of Troy to face Achilles, he does so against the imploring voices of his father, mother, and wife, once again allowing his arrogance to get him in trouble. It is only when it is too late to retreat that Hector realizes his mistake, but the damage is done, and Achilles kills him. Boromir, like Hector, is unswayed by the counsel of others. Where Gandalf and Elrond and the other powerful and wise figures in Middle-earth fear the power the ring could hold over them, and so decide that the only course of action would be to destroy it, Boromir, in his arrogance, wishes not to destroy the ring, but to use it as a weapon against their enemy, to use it in defense of the city. He makes this clear at the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring. Quote, "Boromir stirred, and Frodo looked at him. He was fingering his great horn and frowning. At length he spoke. 'I do not understand all this,' he said. 'Saruman is a traitor, but did he not have a glimpse of wisdom? Why do you speak ever of hiding and destroying? Why should we not think that the great ring has come into our hands to serve us in the very hour of need? Wielding it, the free lords of the free may surely defeat the enemy. That is what he most fears, I deem. The men of Gondor are valiant, and they will never submit, but they may be beaten down. Valor needs first strength and then a weapon. Let the ring be your weapon. If it has such power as you say, take it and go forth to victory.'" Like Hector, Boromir's arrogance leads him to make mistakes and ultimately leads to his death. Despite the protestations of the wise that the ring is too dangerous to be used, and the ultimate decision that it must be destroyed, Boromir never lets go of the idea that the ring could be used to save the city and defeat Sauron. Like Hector facing Achilles, it is his pride that leads to the downfall of Boromir. As he is overwhelmed by the power of the ring himself and attempts to take it by force from Frodo, Frodo escapes from Boromir and sets off to destroy the ring with only Sam, his loyal manservant and companion. Both heroes come to a realization of the mistakes they have made. Hector, standing before the walls, realizes that he cannot defeat Achilles, and though he is too shamed to go into the city and face the other Trojans. Quote, "Fear fell upon Hector as he beheld him, and he dared not stay any longer where he was, but fled in dismay from before the gates." Boromir too realizes his mistake. As Frodo flees from him, he says, quote, "What have I done?" he cried. "What have I done? Frodo, Frodo," he called, "come back. A madness took me, but it has passed. Come back." In either case, it is too late. The damage is done. Hector is run down and killed by Achilles, the fellowship is broken, and Boromir is killed defending Merry and Pippin. A fool's hope. Minas Tirith and Troy, both reinforced by contingents of allies who marched to the city to defend it, both under the care of a great hero, who through his own arrogance falls, both cities ruled by older men who do not themselves participate in battle anymore, and who seem to go mad with grief at losing sons. Priam daring to go to the Greek camp to ransom the body of Hector, and Denethor attempting to burn himself and Faramir on a pyre. But why does Tolkien create such parallels? In his article Troy and the Rings, Tolkien and the Medieval Myth of England, which looks in great detail at the correlations between Gondor and Troy, Boromir and Hector, and Faramir and Paris, Michael Livingston discusses the adoption of the myth of Troy in English literature, in Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chaucer, for example, and that Tolkien, quote, tried to reinvigorate the southern tradition by bringing into harmony with the northern, all within the wondrous epic of his mind, The Lord of the Rings. This rings true on an overarching level, but Tolkien seems to be weaving his allusions to the Iliad into The Lord of the Rings on a number of levels. The myth of Troy is not only one that Tolkien is familiar with through English literature, he would have known it well from his education, and he would have known that Troy is a city fated to fall. By connecting Minas Tirith to Troy, Tolkien is able to play on this fated doom, emphasizing the desperation of the situation faced in the battle against Sauron. Quote, Gandalf put his hand on Pippin's head. There never was much hope, he answered, just a fool's hope, as I've been told. The bleakness of the situation and the lack of hope of victory creates the expectation in the reader that the heroes will ultimately fall, and so the joy of victory when Sauron is finally defeated is that much greater. Thank you very much.